Hello, and welcome back to Extraordinary Connection, a website brought to you by clergy from across the Michigan Annual Conference. My name is Pastor Robert Blanchard, and I am currently serving at Lansing First. I'm glad to be bringing you this devotional today. The last time that I was able to be with you, I shared the story of Maximilian Kolbe in honor of All Saints' Day. I enjoyed sharing his story with you and thought that it might be fun to share more stories about some of the saints who I have on the wall behind me. And since Kolbe was a Franciscan, I figured it makes sense to talk about the man for whom the Franciscan order is named. Now, you've probably at least heard of St. Francis of Assisi, even if you don't know a lot about him. Among other things, he is the patron saint of ecology, and so you may have seen in a friend's garden or have in your own garden a statue of Francis. You'll also see that in this icon, he is preaching to the animals. And there are also several very popular sayings that are misattributed to Francis. One of the sayings that is credited to him, but for which there is no evidence, is that you should preach the gospel at all times and use words when necessary. Another one of the sayings is the prayer of St. Francis, which has been turned into the hymn, "Make Me an Instrument of Your Peace," and is also utilized as part of the recovery process in Alcoholics Anonymous. There are so many other stories about St. Francis, but I just want to draw your attention to one more detail about this icon. It might be a little hard to see, but on his hands and his feet, if you can see those dots, they are to indicate the stigmata that he received through prayer in reflection of Christ's own wounds upon the cross. And hopefully in coming videos, I'll get a chance to talk to you about some of these more miraculous elements of St. Francis's life. But because St. Francis had such an incredible life, I didn't know where I wanted to start talking about him. So I've been rereading my copy of The Little Flowers of St. Francis so that I could refresh my own memory about his life this week. And the Little Flowers are just a collection of stories and legends about St. Francis. And as I was reading, there was a story that jumped out to me as being particularly relevant to the life cycle of the church right now. It's the story of how Francis discerned his own calling as a preacher. Now, before this story begins, Francis had already given up his worldly possessions, and he had already gained a following of devoted Christians. But Francis was torn as to whether he was being called to preach to the world or to withdraw into a life of prayer. So to find the answer, he summoned his companion, Friar Maceo, and he gave Maceo instructions to go to Clare of Assisi and the women of her community and to ask their prayers for Francis. He gave him instructions likewise to go to Friar Sylvester and the men of his community and ask for the same prayer. Now, Friar Sylvester had a vision previously of a golden cross as high as the heavens and as wide as the earth, coming from the mouth of St. Francis. But nonetheless, upon hearing Francis's request, he went straight to prayer about that question that Francis was asking. And the response that was given to both Clare and Sylvester was this: "Go to Friar Francis, and say unto him that God hath not called him to this state for himself alone, but that he may bring forth fruit of souls, and that many may through him be saved." When Friar Maceo returned this answer to Francis, he then replied by saying, "Let us then go forth in God's name." And taking two of his companions, Maceo and Agnolo, he set forth into the world to preach. They came upon a town called Saberniano, where Francis first instructed the birds to be silent so that he could preach, And then, when they had obeyed, he preached with such passion that all the men and the women of the town were ready to abandon their daily lives to follow Christ, just as Francis and his companions had done. Francis, realizing what was happening, encouraged them to continue to live their lives, but to do so according to the principles on which he had preached. He thereby established the Third Order, a community of laity who live according to Franciscan ideals. Now, after having done this, Francis continued on his way until he noticed that the trees all around him were overfilled with birds. So he stopped and preached to his little sisters in the trees, and instructed them to give praise to God for making them as they were, and commissioning them to go into the world and to live as God had called them to live. When he made the sign of the cross for them, the birds lifted into the air and flew to the four ends of the earth. This little flower stood out to me because in the past week, the Board of Ordained Ministry met with me and several of my colleagues to discern whether we would be recommended for ordination and full membership as ministers within the conference. I was reminded that this process of communal discernment, for all of the patience that it requires and for all of the frustrations that it can sometimes breed, is and always has been a vital way in which God speaks into the world. I am extremely grateful that the board voted yes to move me on to ordination, but I know that not all of my colleagues received this answer. And although I've never been on the board, I cannot imagine that it is easy to come to a decision that will cause that kind of pain. Nor do I imagine that they often get as clear an answer in their discernment as Claire and Sylvester received for Francis. The point, though, no matter the outcome of the process, is that not even one as revered as St. Francis acted without the support and the wisdom of his community. And that communal element is something that I think this story so beautifully highlights. Francis then goes on to preach, and when he does so, the result is not what he expected. A whole town is about to be abandoned so that the townspeople can go live at the monasteries. And at this point, Francis has to affirm that we are not all called to serve God in the same ways. He may have been called to a monastic life. I may be called to the life of an ordained clergy person. But everyone is called to the priesthood in their own way. It's not the form of our devotion that matters. It's how we use our gifts for the betterment of the entire community. And of course, being St. Francis, this message of communal health does not stop at the boundaries of the human community. He next turns to the birds of the air to remind them that God has a place for them in creation. And the way that for them to best serve God is to be the birds that they were created to be. So as we think about what it means to live a life of service and praise to God, let us remember the birds of the air. If they can please God by being the best birds that they can be, how can you please God by being the best you that God created you to be? Amen. Before I go today, if you're enjoying this chance to learn about the saints, leave a comment if you're on the Extraordinary Connection website, or like this video if you're watching it on YouTube to let me know. And maybe if you have a saint that you find particularly inspiring or whom you would like to know more about, go ahead and share that too. And if you share that with me, then I may have some ideas for where we can go together in the future. Amen.